August 1944. France was free, but the Allied army was starving. Tanks had no fuel, trucks had no tires, soldiers had no food. The victory in Normandy had come so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. The ports were still in ruins, the railways bombed, and the front was hundreds of miles ahead. Then came the solution, not a weapon, not a general, but a road made of mud, steel, and courage, a road that never slept, never stopped, a road called the Red Ball Express, and it was the lifeline that kept the Allied army moving toward Germany. Chapter 1. The Crisis of Success. August 1944. France was free, but the Allied army was on the verge of collapse. After breaking out from the beaches of Normandy, American tanks and infantry swept across the French countryside faster than anyone had dared to hope. In a single month, they had pushed the German army back hundreds of miles. Paris was liberated. The enemy was in retreat. It looked like victory was within reach. But then everything began to slow down. For the first time since D-Day, Allied commanders faced a new kind of enemy distance. The front line had moved so far and so fast that the supply ships anchored off Normandy could no longer keep up. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every ration still had to come through those same beaches, and from there across hundreds of miles of shattered French roads. The tanks that had broken through German lines were now stranded in the middle of nowhere, their engines silent. Some soldiers joked grimly that they were fighting the Battle of the Gasoline. Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the advance, was burning through 350,000 gallons of fuel a day, and now the pumps were running dry. Along the roads, trucks sat empty. Drivers waited for orders that never came. Airfields had no fuel for their planes. Artillery crews rationed shells as if they were gold. The army that had stormed across France suddenly found itself paralyzed, not by German resistance, but by its own success. Every mile of ground gained meant another mile of supply line stretched thin. Railroads had been destroyed by Allied bombings. Bridges were gone. The ports at Cherbourg and Le Havre were still clogged with wreckage. And all the while, Eisenhower's armies needed to feed, fuel, and arm more than 1 million men every single day. The British had warned about this. So had the logisticians, the quiet planners who understood that in modern war, you can fight faster than you can feed. But in the euphoria of victory, nobody listened. Now, the truth was clear. The Allies had conquered France faster than they could supply it. Unless someone found a way to deliver food, fuel, and ammunition across an entire continent, the liberation of Europe would grind to a halt. And so, in the chaos of late summer 1944, the order went out. Build a road. Make it move. What began as a desperate improvisation would soon become one of the greatest logistical miracles in military history and the lifeline that kept the Allied war machine alive. The Red Ball Express was about to be born. Chapter 2. The Birth of the Red Ball. It began with a crisis meeting not in a marble war room, but in a dusty tent outside Normandy. The generals knew the truth. They had beaten the Germans on the battlefield, but they were losing to logistics. The question was simple. How do you feed, fuel, and arm 1 million men across a country without railroads, bridges, or functioning ports? The answer came from the unglamorous side of war, the engineers and truck drivers, men who knew that victory was not about medals, but movement. General John C. Lee, head of the Services of Supply, proposed the impossible: create a continuous highway hundreds of miles long, dedicated solely to moving supplies from the beaches to the front. No civilian traffic, no stops, no red lights. Just a river of trucks flowing east, day and night, without pause. They called it the Red Ball Express, named after the red circles painted on every supply vehicle, and borrowed from American railroad slang, where red ball meant a priority, nonstop freight run. Within days, the plan became reality. Roads were cleared, bridges reinforced, and entire divisions reassigned from combat to logistics. The route stretched over 700 kilometers from the beaches of Normandy to the front near Chartres and beyond. 2 lanes, one for loaded trucks heading east, one for empties returning west. Traffic moved in a constant loop, marked by red arrows, guarded by MPs, and controlled with military precision. By mid-August 1944, the first convoys rolled out. Thousands of 212-ton GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks thundered down French roads, their engines roaring like an unending drumbeat. They carried everything: fuel drums, ammunition crates, medical supplies, food, spare parts, the lifeblood of the Allied armies. There were no headlights at night, no rest stops, no margin for error. Drivers followed tail lights through the darkness, sleeping only in bursts, eating from tin cans, and pushing their engines to the limit. It was organized chaos, a rolling city of trucks, soldiers, and mechanics that never stopped moving. At its peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles were on the road at any moment, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies a day. The Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was a lifeline built on urgency, ingenuity, and sheer human will. It turned ordinary drivers into heroes and transformed the art of logistics into the beating heart of victory. But the real story was still to come, the story of the men behind the wheel. Chapter 3. The men behind the wheel. They weren't generals or strategists. They didn't appear in newsreels or pose for photographs beside maps and medals. But without them, the Allied advance would have stopped cold on the roads of France. The drivers of the Red Ball Express, the beating heart of the operation, were mostly African-American soldiers, many barely out of their teens. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. Black soldiers were rarely given combat roles. They were sent to service units, cooks, mechanics, laborers, men assigned to work, not to fight. But when the Army ran out of fuel, it turned to the very men it had underestimated, and they answered. They came from Georgia and Detroit, from Chicago and Alabama, thousands of young men who had joined the Army, hoping to prove themselves equal under fire. Instead, they found themselves behind the wheel of a 212-ton GMC truck, with nothing between them and the front lines but a long, dangerous road. They drove through bombed-out villages, under sniper fire, across bridges that shook beneath their tires. Some convoys were ambushed by retreating Germans. Others ran through minefields or got caught in enemy air raids. But they never stopped. Each truck carried enough fuel to keep a tank moving, and every tank that reached the front owed its breath to these drivers. Conditions were brutal. They drove 16 to 20 hours a day, sleeping in their cabs or not at all. Rain turned the roads into mud, engines overheated, tires burst. When a truck broke down, it had to be fixed on the spot under fire in the dark. There were no headlights at night. The drivers followed the dim glow of the taillight ahead, a red dot in the blackness, trusting it like a lifeline. If it disappeared, you were lost. They called themselves the Red Ball Kids. They joked, they sang, they cursed the mud and the endless noise, but they knew the truth. Without them, Patton S. Army wouldn't move an inch. Racism followed them even here. when they returned from the front, many were refused service in cafes they had just resupplied. Their courage didn't make headlines. Their heroism went unmentioned, but they kept driving. Because this wasn't a tea about glory, it was about survival. And deep down, they knew something history didn't yet understand. They weren't just driving trucks. They were driving change. Chapter 4. The Road to Chaos. The Red Ball Express was a miracle of motion, but it was also madness. Every mile was a gamble, every day a fight against exhaustion, breakdown, and chaos. By dawn, the roads were already choked with convoys, hundreds of olive-drab trucks, each roaring, rattling, and belching black smoke. Engines overheated, gears screamed, and dust rolled across France like a brown storm. When it rained, that dust turned to mud thick as glue. Trucks slid off roads, axles snapped, drivers cursed, laughed, and pushed forward anyway. The official rule was simple: keep it moving, no stops, no delays, no excuses. If a truck broke down, you fixed it on the spot or pushed it into a ditch and drove on. Every hour mattered. Every gallon of gasoline was worth more than gold. At night, the convoys transformed into a ghost parade. Headlights were forbidden, any light risked drawing Luftwaffe strafing runs. The drivers followed only the faint red glow of the truck ahead, a floating ember in the blackness. Lose that light, and you vanished into the dark countryside. Some trucks collided. Some simply disappeared, found days later, overturned in ditches or burned out by enemy fire. The Red Ball Route became its own ecosystem, a pulsing organism of motion and noise. Mechanics worked around the clock in makeshift repair depots. Military police directed traffic at crossroads where engines snarled and tempers flared. Fuel dumps burned like torches in the night, and always above the roar of engines came the steady refrain: "Roll on, Red Ball, roll on." Accidents were constant. Exhausted drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Tires exploded from heat. Convoys tangled in wrecks so bad it could take hours to clear the road. And yet, the flow never stopped. The men learned to live inside the chaos. They fixed engines with wire and prayer, shared cigarettes at midnight, and joked that if hell had a highway, it would look just like this. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had delivered more than 100,000 tons of supplies. Patton S tanks were moving again, the front lines alive with momentum. No one on those roads thought of glory, only of the next mile, the next load, the next sunrise. They weren't fighting with guns, but with grit and gasoline, and somehow, against all odds, the chaos worked. The Red Ball never stopped rolling. Chapter 5. Patton S. Lifeline. General George S. Patton was the kind of man who lived for speed. He believed wars were won by motion, by men and machines that never stopped moving. But by late August 1944, even Patton's famous Third Army had come to a halt. Not because of the enemy, but because his tanks were out of gas. Every one of his armored divisions was consuming fuel faster than it could be delivered. A single Sherman tank burned 2 gallons per mile, and Patton had thousands of them. He could see the German army retreating just ahead, but his tanks sat motionless, silent, like predators that had run out of breath. That S, when the Red Ball Express became more than a supply route. It became Patton S. Lifeline. From the beaches of Normandy to the front near Verdun, 6,000 trucks rumbled day and night, hauling millions of gallons of gasoline, mountains of ammunition, and endless crates of rations. Convoys were timed to arrive exactly when Patton S. spearheads were about to run dry. If they were late by even a few hours, an entire division could be stranded. The drivers knew it. They weren't just moving supplies, they were moving history. Patton knew it too. He visited the convoys often, stalking the muddy roads in his polished helmet and ivory-handled pistols, yelling at officers, shaking hands with drivers. One story spread quickly among the men. Patton stopped a convoy one night, walked up to a young black driver, and told him, "Son, you're the most important man in this army." For once, it wasn't exaggeration. Each day, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,000 tons of supplies, enough to keep Patton's army advancing across France. Fuel drums were unloaded straight into jerry cans and tossed from truck to tank. There was no time for ceremony, no rest for anyone. If a driver slept 2 hours, he was lucky. Sometimes Patton's men would wave from the roadside as the trucks rolled by, raising their helmets in salute. The Red Ball drivers rarely waved back. They were too tired and too focused on the next mile. By early September, thanks to their effort, Patton's tanks were once again roaring eastward, smashing through the German defenses toward the Moselle River. But the faster he advanced, the longer the supply lines grew. The Red Ball Express was winning the race against time, but every victory came at a cost. The road ahead would soon test the limits of men and machines alike. Chapter 6. The Cost of Momentum. By the fall of 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a legend in motion, a highway that never slept, pulsing like a steel artery through the heart of France. But beneath the thunder of engines and the rhythm of rolling wheels, a quieter truth was taking shape. The men were breaking down faster than their machines. The pace was merciless. Each driver was expected to cover more than 400 miles a day, often on little food, less sleep, and roads that looked more like battlefields than highways. Dust turned the air thick as smoke by day. At night, fog and rain reduced visibility to nothing. Drivers learned to navigate by instinct, by sound, vibration, and the faint red glow of the taillight ahead. One soldier said it best: "You didn't drive the truck. You held on and prayed it didn't die before you did." They called it the most dangerous non-combat job in the war. And it was. Accidents were constant. Trucks collided in the dark, overturned in ditches, burst into flames from leaking fuel. Enemy planes sometimes strafed the convoys. Drivers were ordered never to stop even when fired upon, because one halted truck could block 100 behind it. The exhaustion was unimaginable. Some soldiers taped their eyelids open to stay awake. Others drove half asleep, waking only when the tires hit the edge of the road. It wasn't uncommon for a driver to complete a 20-hour run, eat a cold can of beans, and be sent right back out within hours. Fuel became their obsession. Every drop was life. Drivers joked that gasoline ran through their veins, but behind the humor was a grim reality. If a convoy ran dry, the front line died with it. There was no glory here, no medals or fanfare. The Red Ball Express didn't make headlines like the battles in Paris or Arnhem. But Eisenhower knew the truth. He later said, "The Red Ball Express was the lifeline of our armies. Without it, victory would have been impossible." By October 1944, the strain was showing. Engines failed, men collapsed, trucks burned out. Yet still, they rolled on a symphony of courage, fatigue, and sheer willpower. Every soldier at the front ate because of them. Every tank moved because of them. Every step toward Berlin depended on the drivers who refused to stop even when everything in them said they should. Chapter 7. The Unsung Heroes. The Red Ball Express wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a human one, and most of that human power came from soldiers who history almost forgot. More than 75 of Red Ball Express drivers were African American, men who had been told by their own country that they weren't equal, now carrying the entire U.S. Army on their backs. They weren't allowed to fight on the front lines, but without them, the front couldn't move an inch. In segregated units, they slept in separate tents, ate in separate mess halls, and yet when Patton S. tanks roared for fuel, no one cared what color the hands were that delivered it. Private Ernest Smitty Smith from Alabama once said, "They told us we couldn't fight, so we just decided to outwork everybody instead," and they did. Through exhaustion, rain, racism, and wrecked trucks, they kept the supplies flowing. Some drivers formed tight brotherhoods, swapping spare parts in the dark, sharing jokes through the roar of engines, painting names on their trucks like Aunt Hattie, Black Magic, or Birmingham Express. Those trucks became more than machines. They were symbols of pride, defiance, and survival. Our commanders started to notice. By September 1944, General Patton himself praised the Red Ball drivers, saying their work kept our Army on its feet. But recognition was slow to come. Most of these men returned home to a country still divided by segregation, their heroism buried under silence. Yet their impact was undeniable. They proved with sweat, skill, and courage that the war for democracy abroad could not have been won without democracy as most excluded sons. In the years that followed, few medals were awarded, few parades were held. The Red Ball Express faded into the background of victory, overshadowed by tanks, generals, and headlines. But among those who served, there was never any doubt who had saved the advance. A white lieutenant later said, "When you saw those convoys rolling, you stopped and saluted, because you knew those boys were keeping you alive." By the time the Red Ball shut down in November 1944, it had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, enough to feed, fuel, and arm an army that marched straight into Germany. The men didn't ask for glory. They asked only that the story be told, and decades later, it finally was. Epilogue: the road that won the war. Long after the engines went silent and the dust settled over France, the story of the Red Ball Express lived on not in parades or textbooks, but in the quiet hum of highways that stretch across America. Because the truth is simple: wars are won by those who can move. In the summer of 1944, the world watched as armored columns and infantry divisions pushed east, but behind every advance was a convoy of trucks that never stopped. They weren't glamorous, they weren't armed, but they were unstoppable. Each wheel that turned carried the promise of victory. Each mile conquered with sweat, fuel, and courage. When Patton S. tanks thundered into Germany, the Red Ball Express was already there, unseen, unheard, but essential as the air those soldiers breathed. Imagine it. The night sky over France lit not by artillery, but by the glowing brake lights of thousands of trucks, a river of red stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Europe. Engines rumbling like distant thunder. Tired hands gripping steering wheels slick with sweat. Men too exhausted to speak, yet too determined to stop. Those roads, dirt, gravel, broken and bombed, became the arteries of a continent's liberation. When victory finally came, it didn't just belong to the generals or the pilots or the tank crews. It belonged to the drivers who never made the headlines. The men who carried democracy on 4 worn-out tires. Many of them never told their stories. They came home quietly, went back to factories and farms, their heroism hidden behind ordinary lives. But every time a convoy moves across a highway today, every time logistics turns chaos into order, it carries a trace of their legacy. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply route, it was proof of what unity, grit, and faith in purpose can achieve. It showed that victory doesn't always roar through the skies or roll on tank treads. Sometimes it rumbles in the dark, through mud, fear, and fatigue, driven by men who believed that the road ahead could change the world. And it did. The Red Ball Express, the road that won the war. Because history remembers the battles, but victory rides on the wheels of those who kept moving.